conditioning is spot on working today. It's fantastic. I want to thank the people in the building who got that figured out. It's just like, oh, big deal. Anyway, so we've got some great talks on today. But first we're eating. How good is that? We're going to do 3 talks. We're going to do a short talk, and we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to take a break and just have a good old chat. And I'm going to do another deep dive later on and then have some like announcements and Q&A. So first up, we're going to have Mike and Matt, and they're going to talk about harnessing power of volunteers for community benefit. And then after that, we're going to have Mair Swartz, who's going to come up and talk about the use of context APIs with React. And then we're going to have Teese come up after the break, and he's going to do an in-depth talk about how they scaled from 2 developers in React to 20. All right. So first up, we'll have Matt and Mike.
All right, we just need a moment to get the tech right. Okay, everything's gone over there. Bring that back home. Take the shine off my hair. This one. No, not that one.
There's a green button.
The green button?
Yeah, on the left. That'll make it full screen.
That's it.
Yeah.
Good. Oh, yes.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, there's something to make it full screen, mate. Because exit full screen. All right, we'll live with that. Okay, we're ready. All right.
Oh, yeah?
Welcome. This is Matt.
Hey.
I'm Mike. Matt will have a section in the talk a little bit later on.
Speak to the speaker.
Speak to the speaker. A bit closer. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thing it. All right. I'll pick it up because I tend to move around a bit. All right. I'm going to talk to you about back to bikes. My name is Mike. I'm a full stack developer working in React these days. Quite enjoy that space, like all the leading edge new stuff. I work on a job 4 days a week, and I have 1 day a week at a place called Back to Bikes, which I started 5 years ago. And I'll talk about the journey that we've gone through and how I started this thing with a bunch of volunteers, and it's just grown beyond my initial conception. And don't worry, there's some React stuff in there too. All right, so to recycle bikes, and the mission statement was to train people in bike repair and to provide bikes for affordable transport for people who couldn't afford it. And really it was a play around recycling. I had this idea that people have these bikes in their sheds that they don't use. Let's get them out, let's get them back on the road. It turns out that it was a lot more than that. I was looking for a place to run it, and I found the South Melbourne Commons. The Friends of the Earth got together with Father Bob at the time. Some of you may remember him. He was quite good in terms of community engagement, and there was the Galilee Primary School, which was derelict, and the Friends of the Earth got together and basically restored it. They had a bunch of volunteers and they made it the South Melbourne Commons, which is a community centre. And we were allowed to work there. And as you can see from the photo, we were outside on the veranda, so we didn't have a proper place. We were just there. We were undercover at least, which was good. And then this was our workshop. Basically, it was a pop-up workshop in a box. And Robin there is designing the toolboard, which basically slid into the front of that. So it just sort of tucked away, and we put it under the stairs at the end of the day. It used to be funded by me. The money came out of my back pocket. So I was always looking for ways of generating income. We got onto a gig with the Port Phillip published a grant. They wanted somebody to fix bikes at the specialist school. So we stuck our hands up for that, won the contract, and went round and fixed their bikes. The kids in the specialist school, special needs kids basically, they're not very mobile when they're walking around. You put them on a bike and they're lethal. You know, they charge up and down the yard, they smash their bikes into each other and, you know, take great delight in it and break them. So we had a challenge in fixing those bikes. We also did like Right to Work Day. The Port Phillip Council would sponsor us to basically appear at the South Melbourne Market and the St Kilda Town Hall. And we also ran some evening maintenance courses for people to teach them how to fix bikes. All right, in 2013, I think it was, Father Bob was forcibly retired and Father Julian wasn't as community oriented as Father Bob was, so he decided that the South Melbourne Commons needed to revert to use of the parishioners, whatever that was. So basically it closed down. We had to find a new home. Luckily, somebody had a word with Port Phillip Council about us and said, look, don't let this thing die. They found us some sheds. I'm on the roof there with another guy, Robin, who came along pretty much on the second or third day, on the roof of the shed. And it was a huge step up for us because we had an open space, you know, a dedicated space. It was lockable, it was semi-covered, we could have all our bikes inside. So from being outside to being inside and being dedicated was a huge thing. We were attracting a bunch of volunteers. We were open like 1 day a week. I had a day off from my previous job. You can see a pattern there, can't you? And we had probably 5 or 6 people that would turn up every week and do some work for us. So fast forward to 2017, things have grown amazingly. Like people turn up and the thing has grown to the point where I thought it was about recycling, but it's more about engagement with the community, getting people involved. People come, they treat it like a job replacement. They may be retired, they come along for 1 or 2 days a week. They're happy to work on bikes, they're learning about bikes, they're contributing to the community. We give bikes to everyone that we can, we sell some, we get given bikes. We're now profitable, we're growing. You know, we lobbied Port Phillip for a larger shed because we were bursting out of the space we had. Bernadine Voss, the Mair of Port Phillip, came down and had a look and she goes, yep, I like this idea. And I said to her, look, who do I need to talk to in council? And she said, leave it with me. And a few weeks later it happened and we were allowed to move into the shed. We generate some money, so we actually service the Port Phillip specialist school bikes for free now. And they came along, and you see the picture here on the wall. They built, they painted the mural for us. So it's an amazing thank you from them. And part of the thing we did was, you know, the bigger capacity. We knew that there was demand there, so it's like a build it and they will come. So we make the facility, we start using it on a more regular basis. We spent some money on the upgrade. We put lighting in, we put fans, we put awnings, we concreted an area. We put another cover in, we built racks for the bikes. We employed a full-time workshop manager. That's improving our customer service. We've got more workstations. We're probably the biggest bike workshop in Melbourne now. You know, there are bigger shops like Ivanhoe Cycles is huge, but their workshop area is quite small at the back. It's an all-weather facility. And we look pretty professional, so you know it's amazing. And we're getting 10 to 15 volunteers per day, 6 days a week. So as you can imagine, our throughput is increasing, and we're sort of taking that opportunity to mount a bunch of projects. We're doing some marketing. I found a guy who worked for the city of Marseille in France, and he's happy to come. He's a bike nut, and he says, "Yeah, I'll come and help you do some marketing," which is amazing. We're working on a new website. We've got a women's group going on. We're engaging the other schools in the area to do some more artwork. Some of the schools are doing work experience programs, sending kids along to us. And we're also looking at, we have some challenges as we grow. We need to track volunteers moving in and out of the workshop. We need to track the jobs that are going through. We need to look at parts ordering and all that kind of stuff. And at this point, I'll hand over to Matt, who is raring and ready to go? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right. So yeah, I won't introduce him. He'll do that himself.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt. How's everyone going? All right. Thanks for the clap. How the burritos going? Are they good? Yeah. My name's Matt. I've been coding for about a year and a half. I started off as a barista. It's the last cafe I worked at, and I'm hopefully going to keep it that way because that place was a bit of a laugh. Got a graphic design background, and I worked as a barista probably for about 10 years around Melbourne. 6 months ago, I quit graphic design at uni. I quit my job, I sold all my stuff, and I just threw myself into coding. So just loving it, and I wanted to get a job as a developer and build up my developer portfolio. That was my goal. Quite like that. That's quite a good laugh, that one. Does anyone find that funny, or is it just me? It's quite funny. Are you a major party pooper? We have fresh decaf, but you're only fooling yourself. Okay, cool. Well, anyway, 4 months ago, or maybe 6 months ago, I started Free Code Camp. Does anyone know what Free Code Camp is here? Yeah? A few nods in the room. Worked my way through the whole curriculum here, all the way to the back end stuff. 6 months in, okay, I've got some skills now. I've put in a lot of time. I did about 30, 40 hours a week, like really just went for it. I loved it. 6 months in, I find myself with a plethora of completely useless toy apps that taught me a lot, granted, and I put them on GitHub, woohoo, but who is going to look at them? Are they, what's the point, basically? That was good fun to use, but what do I do now? I basically feel like I'm climbing this huge mountain, and at the top of the mountain is maybe like building a Netflix clone, and then actually going out and looking for a job, but didn't really feel that realistic. And by that time, I was getting complete JavaScript fatigue, feeling like, oh my God, I don't know what to learn next. I've just thrown all my time into this. The industry is a bit scary. It's full of people that look like that. I went to a developer meetup and called Ask a Dev. I'm just going to announce that to everyone. Ask a Dev. It's a new meetup where you can basically get mentorship. Anyway, at that place, I met Mike. And he started telling me about his back to bikes. And I thought, why climb the mountain by myself when I can climb it with lots of other people? But I'd probably be going a little bit faster than everyone, because do you know that Mount Everest is actually like that? There's actually a queue up there. It's a bit of a joke. Anyway, so I threw myself into his project, making an attendance app. And there's a few other guys, Zach and Joe, that started it up a year or two ago. Like, that's when the idea was seeded, but sort of never really got going. So I kind of jumped in a few weeks ago only. I've only known Mike a few weeks, and now here I am talking in front of the React meetup. Threw myself into it, and we've got a working MVP attendance app. The problems that it's solving, that the volunteers will register, and they'll get involved, they'll turn up. They might turn up once a week, several times a week, once a month only, or they might never turn up. But what happens is, like, there's so many people coming in and out that you don't know who's coming and what's going on. And people are like, oh, what happened to Harry? He was a great guy or whatever, Bloody Sheila, where's she gone to? That kind of stuff. But there's no idea, like, there's no like way of knowing what happened to that person. Like, did something happen? There's something we need to know about. There's some incident that happened. So we started a basic version in Meteor. It's pretty straightforward. I'm learning heaps from it. Mike's been a great mentor. And we're using React, obviously. We've got Storybook for the components. We're using Jest testing. Like, Mike's just brought in like heaps of awesome like tools and frameworks to work in it. So there's a lot to learn from it, and there's a lot to offer it as well. So I mean, who here is like just starting off with React or interested in getting it? Can I get a show of hands, please? Okay, and then who's been working in it for a few years? Okay, so cool, all sorts. So for the people that are just starting off, like this is a great project to learn about React and like get involved in something with a positive outcome. And for you that are pro, it's a great thing to like give back to something that's really positive. And if you're interested in helping people learn, like me, because I've got heaps to learn, then please get involved. We also have the Apollo GraphQL version, which Mike's really interested in, like learning, and so am I, seeing the differences between the two. Here's an initial sort of wireframe. It's a little bit of an eyesore for my graphic design background, but that's all right. That's the sign-in screen. That's what it looks like at the moment in Storybook. So basically, this is what's running. We're using semantic UI with React. So this is all working. Like you can sign in and out and search, and you can add a new volunteer. So people click on their card, they sign in, which goes to this screen. And it basically is just like trying to make people feel welcome and like make them feel part of something. And you know, they let us know if they've been here, if they want to be here for a half day or a full day. And then when they sign in, it just slots into that part. And then this week I've been working on a form using quite a cool JSON schema semantic UI thing where you dump in an object to the schema and it basically gives you that. Yeah, so from this project, I've learned heaps about like making a React app with the future in mind, you know, with not just doing something at home, like doing the to-do apps and blah, blah, blah. I've learned something that, you know, it's going to be expandable. I've learned heaps about actually naming components, just simple stuff like this that you actually need to learn in like a real world project. So that's been really valuable for me. Using Git in a realistic, collaborative way, you know, like not getting things all mixed up. So far it's been really rewarding. So yeah, we have the workshop app. In the pipeline, we have a workshop parts app, which will plug in to a wholesaler's database somewhere, and then we'll be able to give retail prices. And then the workshop app will help with tracking bikes as they move through the workshop process. So there's a fair bit of, I get pretty excited about it. It's pretty like cool stuff to make, and it's for a really positive cause. So Mike, can you come up here and just do a little bit of something? Anyway, thank you. You've been a great audience.
Thank you, Matt. Well, yeah, look, we're the apps that we're building are all open source. They're up on GitHub. You're welcome to download, play with them. If you feel like getting involved, then feel free to contact us. We're looking for help in any dimensions. React developers, we need some help in the design work, although Matt probably wants that part of it.
No, I want to code.
He wants to code. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not interested in
fantastic. I mean, you know, there's lots of opportunities. If you want to get involved, come to the workshop and have a look, get a feel for the vibe of the place, because it's really positive. It's just a very positive energy. You can have lunch with all the volunteers, you can cut some code, you can feel a part of it. So it's just a very positive experience. Make the most of it.
I got 3 questions.
3 questions.
Let me just finish and then I'll open for questions, because one more slide. I think there is. And I'd like to do a big thank you for Mentor Loop, because I'm working for them at the moment. They allow me to work 4 days a week, which gives me the 1 day for Back to Bikes. And they're also hiring at the moment, so come and talk to me afterwards if you are interested. So yeah, questions, please.
First question is that when you have the problems and you don't know how to fix it, who do you
Oh, I asked Matt.
Hardly.
And he asked Google. And Google has the answers. Yeah,
Maybe say the question.
So yeah, Stack Overflow is a primary resource. Google generally, you just put in the error message and search for it.
Yeah, go. That's interesting. So he asked, what do you do when you're stuck? So like when I've been coding at home, I've been stuck for days on end at times, and it's absolutely ruined me. And then I've been telling people, oh, I don't even wait 5 minutes. That's what some other people say before I ask for help. But I'm not a person that gets spoon-fed stuff. I do learn a lot. But there are a number of Slack groups that I got signed up to that I can come and ask me if you want to know about them. They're like Melbourne based, and there's another international one. There's a Discord app as well, which is all React stuff. And there's a channel for literally everything that you want to know. So you're not alone. There you go.
Okay.
Second question, do you have any free t-shirt giveaway?
Free t-shirts.
You can buy a t-shirt for $25.
Third question, do you have any bike to give away?
Do we have bikes to give away? If you are a deserving cause, we will give you a bike. No problem. Get your caseworker to contact us and we'll give you a free bike. Yeah, and of course, anybody who needs a bike, come and visit us. We're open 6 days a week now.
Any other questions?
We have lots of mountain bikes. They're very common. Any other questions?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mair, you next?
Thanks, Mike. Cheers.
Oh yeah, that's right. You know him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because he worked here for a while, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, he was helping out Nerd Girls and I was there.
Yeah.
Fantastic, guys. That was awesome. Next up, we have Mair. Mair's going to tell us about the new context API.
I will, just as soon as I get everything working.
Once we're sorted.
Get the tape right.
This will get everybody's attention.
You think you're ready?
Yeah.
All right. Give it up to Mair.
Thank you, guys. It's good to see you again. So I have a little bit of a talk I want to give to you today. I got no slides. It's going to be very code-centric. It is a deep dive. So hang on to your hats, okay? And I'm hoping that I cover at least some basic stuff that you guys can get to. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, okay? I do have a limited time, but I'll try and facilitate you as much as I can. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is the new Context API, the new React Context API. Has anybody over here heard about the Context API? Yeah, quite a few. Okay, so has anybody heard about the new Context API? Okay, a little bit less. Okay, so if you look at the documentation, or if you did at least a couple of months ago, about the Context API given for React, the one thing that basically say to you is, unless you're really, 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 really good at what you're doing, don't use it. You say, it's broken. It comes with a penalty, and it's got all sorts of problems with it, and it's experimental, and you should only really use it if you're authoring libraries, okay? And this was very true, probably pretty much from the inception of React. I mean, I first came across the Context API many, many years ago. I don't know how long it's been around, but it's been around for a good couple of years. And they fixed it, okay? So what problems does the Context API resolve? Who over here uses Redux? Right, everybody pretty much. Okay, well, there's a slight problem with Redux. I mean, this is personal, okay? I mean, we're all entitled to opinions, I guess. My problem with Redux, I use it, I love it. It works, it's really good, okay? It's got lots of benefits to it. The thing I don't like about Redux is that if I've got a very small change, I want to sort of go over to the network, I want to basically grab something, I want to toggle a little bit of, you know, black and white, something that would essentially take me 3 lines of code to write if I was using sort of general React state. Well, what do I have to do now? Well, I'm going to basically do a whole bunch of stuff. Map state to props, map dispatch to props, then essentially I've got an action, then I've got a reducer, then I've got a thunk. I mean, how much code do I need to basically do? I mean, I'm talking not just a couple more lines of code, I'm talking modules more in terms of my pull requests, just so that I could make a very small change. And that's a problem with Redux, okay? It is very robust. And if you don't believe me, Dan Abramov says so as well. He's the author of it. And he basically says, there's, you know, it could be better. All right, so we've got Redux. Who over here uses MobX? A couple of guys. MobX is really good. It actually is a lot less robust, and it's really, really good, okay? But there's 2 problems with MobX. Firstly, right, you have this problem of, you can create as many of these little sort of isolated pockets of states or stores as you want. And as you basically go down, you find that all of a sudden you need to get this state over here to talk to this state over there, and you didn't think about how you architected it, and now you're in trouble, okay? So the guy that actually authored MobX came up with a really good solution, right? It's called MobX State Tree. If you haven't heard about it, check it out, it's awesome. But there's a still more problem with it. How many over here use MobX State Tree? My point exactly. That's the problem with it. Nobody knows about it, okay? So, Facebook have basically fixed their React Context API. Is it a replacement for Redux? No, it's not. Okay, there are places where Redux actually really, really is necessary. Very highly complicated, very, very big structured apps, right? MobX as well. There is a time and place for it. But if you basically got a couple of components and you want to basically do a couple of things, and you've got, let's say, for example, 15, 20, 30, I don't know how many components, the new Context API is worth considering. So this is what I'm here to basically talk to you about tonight, the new Context API. Okay. Now, before we actually get into the new Context API, if you were to basically just look at it up front, you're going to say, what the hell is this? Because it actually requires that you actually know about a particular pattern, or you understand a particular pattern before you actually start to use it. So that's a prerequisite, and we're going to be covering that as well. It's called a function as child component. Anybody here actually created one of those things? Yeah, not many people. Okay, so there is this thing called a function as child component, and that's what we're going to cover first. We're going to see what it's used for, how it works, and then from there we'll basically go into the context API and see how that works. So I don't have any slides, but I do have a lot of code to write. So, you know, as I'm writing this, if you find that I'm making mistakes, I am basically doing live code. Just, you know, say, hey, just stop, hang on, wait, but it's all cool. I'm happy if you guys can help. This can be a collaborative effort, I don't mind. Okay. So, you know, this code and everything else will be available online afterwards. Okay. We are recording this, so, you know, you don't have to basically try and sort of type everything if you want to. Just listen. And let's have a look at how we go. All right, so let's have a look and see what I've got. I've got a basic starter. I don't want to basically type everything from scratch. A very, very basic starter, okay? I'm just going to collapse this here because I don't need it. By the way, can you guys at the back see the code okay? No? That's why we have Zoom. How's that? Is that better? Maybe a bit bigger. Hey, you're kind of throttling my real estate here, mate. Okay, let's try. That's as big as I can probably get it, yeah? All right, cool. Is that cool? Yeah, you can see that? All right. So I'm just going to basically bring this out over here and just show you what I've got. I've got essentially my index.js. I've stripped it down. It's essentially a create React app, but I've stripped it down just to keep it really simple. I've got my create React app over here. And if you have a look, you can see that's pretty much standard. I'm basically finding an element in my DOM and I'm mounting my application on it. Okay. And that basically is calling my app.js. My app.js is very simple. It basically has two components. By the way, I made this trivial. I made this really, really simple because we're talking about fundamentals here, right? We're not talking about use cases. We're talking about building blocks. So I've tried to make this as simple as I can. Okay, so we've got two components here. And essentially, let's have a look at the first one. Okay, well, I'm just going to basically go through this with you very quickly. Right, the first one has essentially got a state, which is a position. And now, essentially, what we're doing over here is we've got this React component that basically uses this thing called ref, all right, which is essentially going to point to a function, which is this over here, right? So over here, right, who over here knows what the ref's API is? Not many people. Okay, so very simply, right, ref API, okay, this thing over here will give you a function, or basically you point it to a function, and it'll pass to you the element once it's rendered on the DOM. So if you basically ever had a React application and you had this really cool jQuery component that you wanted to basically slap onto it, you can't do that in here because remember that this over here is not HTML. It's markup for JavaScript. So jQuery wouldn't know how to handle this. But once this is finished rendering and basically gets put onto the HTML, your ref API, which is basically this thing over here, saying, all right, give me a function, and the function basically saying pass me an element, is going to pass you that actual HTML div. And then you can slap whatever you want onto it. You can do whatever you like with it. So that's actually sitting there in the DOM, okay? So that's essentially what the ref API is, okay? Everybody happy with that explanation? Okay, so what happens is I get this element, all right, and then I'm basically attaching an on-mouse move to it, okay? This is essentially, so element of on-mouse move is equal to a function where I'm basically just gonna set the X and Y positions, okay? So I'm setting state for the X and Y positions. Very, very simple, right? Very clear? All right, right, so that's essentially my example number one. Example number two is exactly the same. So essentially, we've got the state. We're using a ref API over here. We're basically going to get a position for X and Y and set our state to it. Okay, but this thing does something slightly different. It doesn't only basically print out the X and Y positions. It also does something interesting with the color. Right. So here it is over here. And as I basically mouse over there, you can see essentially that the color changes. Over here, it's basically going darker and lighter, and over here it's basically doing the grayscale. And over here, it's just basically giving me the coordinates, okay? Very simple. Okay, cool. So This is essentially the base of my application, but there is a problem with this application. What's the problem with this application? Anybody tell me what the problem with this application is? Eh? Exactly. Where's my dry concept, right? Don't repeat yourself. I've got this over here, and this over here is essentially the same code. So let's fix that. And we're going to do that with something called a function as child component. Let's go ahead and create a new JavaScript file called facc.js. Okay, and I'm just going to copy this guy. I'm just going to copy this one over here. This is essentially example number 1. Wow. Copy. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to basically change the name of this thing to capitalized. Make sure you always have capitalized FACC function as state component. Okay. All right. And it basically is going to not return. It's going to do exactly the same thing, except for with regards to this child component, right? It's going to do something a little bit special, a little bit unique. Okay. When we basically have a React element like this over here, there's a couple of things we can basically we can pass into it. One of them is essentially a React element or string. Something else we can actually pass to it is something that looks like this. This dot props dot children. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pass in this dot state. Okay. Right. So that might seem a little bit new to some of you. Okay. So in essence, what we're doing is we're passing in the children. So this thing is going to be a parent, and we're going to basically pass in the children, and we're saying whatever the children is, within there, pass in a parameter. This is essentially the pattern. Okay. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and actually see how we can actually utilize this. So I'm going to go back to my example number 1, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and import something from FACC, okay? So essentially I'm going to import my function as child component, okay? Right, and now I don't need state anymore. That can basically come out. That basically gets eliminated, okay? And the other thing I don't need anymore is this particular parent, but we'll basically handle that in just a second. Okay, so what is it that I do need? Well, I need my function as child component, okay? So I'm just going to basically create an instance of that. Okay, and what does this actually happen inside here? Well, basically, what actually happens, and this is essentially where it gets a little bit confusing, but I'll just explain this very quickly. When we use this pattern, okay, we basically are going to get the parameter back. In this case, it's essentially the position of the mouse. It's this thing over here, okay? But we can't just, we don't have any variables or anything else like that to basically hook it onto. I mean, what is it we don't have any declaration that explains to us what it actually is. So React basically works in this way, right, where what actually happens is we have a function. It returns a function, okay? And now what I can do is I can simply basically take this over here, pass that into there, all right? This comes out. All right, and of course we don't use the state anymore, so this becomes pos. And this becomes pos, all right? So let's go ahead and save that. Come back here. And if I haven't totally screwed it up, it still works. Cool. All right, so once again, all right, just to basically reiterate, right? My function as child component basically accepts this dot children and as a child to an element, okay? And they'll basically pass in whatever parameters I want to. And then essentially coming back to, so I'm coming back to the consumer of that child component, right? Whatever it's going to encapsulate is going to be given a function. And that function is going to hold as a parameter the value that I basically passed in as a child. What's very cool is over here, if I wanted to, I can also basically do something else, like, pass in a val equals whatever. And then over here, I could basically say this dot props is equal to, so it gives me a way to basically work as if React components were a function, passing in properties and returning parameters. Pretty interesting. I know, it's wild. Okay, but wait, there's more. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to clean up the second one by doing the same thing. So if you guys didn't quite get that, let's do that again. So I'm going to get this father's child component. I'm going to basically eliminate the state, going to get rid of all of that. Okay, I'm going to need to get rid of this as well. Okay, and then essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to basically wrap my FACC. Okay, and what does this basically pass back to me? This passes back to me a function. So that's going to be my position. And inside there, I can basically simply say, all right, I just want to render this stuff here. Oops. Okay, so I'm used to working with my other keyboard, so just bear with me. All right, then obviously we don't want X and Y. What we want is this. Pos.x, pos.y. And over here, pos.x, pos.y. And if I didn't make a complete balls up, oh. Sorry, say again? Pos.position over here. Yeah? Like this? Is that what I've done? All right. If you say so. Hey? Yep, you're right. Oh, the next one. Sorry, guys. Yes. Okay. Okay. I do have a get out of jail card, right? I do have a bunch of branches in GitHub, so if I completely screw it up, I can always revert to that. But let's see if we can get this to work. Okay. Right. Let's see. Did I screw that up? No, it works. Awesome. All right. Cool. So that's a function as child component. If you learned anything tonight, hopefully you've learned what a function as child component is tonight. Okay. It's useful because essentially, if you have a look at the initial code that we had, right, you can see that this is tremendously simple. It's gone from a whole class into just like 1 or 2 lines of code. And if you look out there, there's a lot of libraries such as Spring.js, which is essentially an animation library. They use this pretty much exclusively. So now when you see this pattern, you know what it is. There's another brother to this, or essentially a sibling, and that's essentially a parameter or a property that does the same thing. So essentially you can actually have in here a property, and then essentially you can have div blah, 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 blah. But it works on the same principle. Okay, right, cool. So let's get on with the next part of the speech, which is the function as child component. Yes?
Before you go, can you show me the diagrams again?
The actual live demo?
Yeah, the diagram.
Yeah.
You think the red one is out of sync?
That's because that's a class problem. Good catch. There we go. Fixed. Let's make sure it's all saved. All right, there you go. Yep. Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Okay, let's get on with the function as child component. All right. So in order to do that, right, there's a couple of steps that we're going to need to do. And these are essentially the building blocks as to how to actually create one of these things. So firstly, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file. And I'm going to call this thing my context or whatever. Okay, .js. All right. And then I'm going to go ahead and import React from React. Okay. So with the new context API, I can do this. I can basically say const. Let's call it, what are we going to call it? Mouse context is equal to React dot context. Oh, wait. Create context. So this is a new beast. Okay. And what's really cool is I can actually give it some default values, which means that I don't have to worry about null so much. So essentially over here, I'm going to say x is 0, y is 0. All right, cool. So then once I've actually created this context, the next thing I'm going to do is actually create a React component. Let's go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and say class mouse, and this is going to basically be my provider, much like we have in Redux. Okay, my provider, class my provider, extends React dot component. Okay, and then of course the one thing we have to have in here is a render method. Okay, in fact, why am I actually writing it out? Because it looks very, 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 very similar to this. Okay, all right. So you can see that there's definitely a sort of a little pattern coming in here. All right, but this is going to be a little bit different. Okay. The way that this is going to work is as follows, right? We're going to have this thing called a context, or in this case, a mouse context. So this is essentially this object here that I'm referring to up here, okay? Dot provider. Let's just get an instance of that, right? We'll just basically clean it up. Okay. And this thing is going to, instead of basically passing it as a child, this thing actually takes a value. And what we're going to basically pass to it in this case is we're going to pass it this dot state dot position. All right. Okay, so we have now, let's just basically collapse this out. The basic premise. And what actually comes inside here? This dot props dot children. Okay, so same but different. The only difference is we're not passing in the actual properties anymore, or the value. We're basically just passing that into this value over here. All right, so now we need to basically wire this up so that we can consume it. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and do that in the index.js. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to go ahead and import. What did we call it? Context.js? Oh, yeah, I haven't actually exported it yet. There's two things I need to export. That's a very important point. Two things I need to export. The first one is essentially I'm going to export this class here. The other thing I'm going to export, put that into a bit of a wrapper. The other thing I'm going to export is a provider that comes from the mouse context. So let's have a look and see how that would work. Let's go ahead and export a constant value called mouse consumer. Oops, sorry. And that's going to be equal to, no, I'm missing an N. Check me cheat. Haha. I call that mouse context dot consumer. So I have a provider and I have a consumer. Okay. All right. So how do I use this thing? Well, if I come here to my index.js, right, first thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to actually get an instance of that. I'm going to say import from my context. And what I want here is just the mouse provider. And this should look very similar to what it looks like in things like Redux, right? So there's our mouse provider. Okay, so what that basically means is that my whole entire application, my whole entire state tree is now aware of this context that we've just created. Okay, so everything inside my tree is going to be aware of it. Okay, now what's nice is that I don't have to basically make any changes to app.js in order to consume it if I don't want to. Okay, but I think I might. So let's go ahead and do that. So essentially, just in terms of how do I consume it, let's create a component that will consume it. Let's call this eg3.js. And this is going to look very similar to this one. Are you guys tracking with me? Is it a bit fast, or you guys? Yeah, is it okay? Okay, right. Let's go to the this eg3. All right, and we don't need this context anymore, right? What I need to import, you guessed it. This is going to be the consumer. I don't know why I didn't see it. Hey? Ah, no? Sorry? Well, let's have a look. So, mouse consumer. That's what it should be. Ah, is that what's wrong? Ah, yes. I got you. Good catch. Context. There we go. Right. Okay. So let's have a look and see how that works. So we're basically going to put in the mouse consumer. All right. And if I've done everything right, go ahead and save all of this. Sorry? Okay. All right, so the one thing that we forgot to do, or I forgot to do, shall I say, right, is essentially we've got this new class there, but we didn't actually add it to here. Let's go ahead and add it. Yeah, I'll have to change the class name as well. So that's 3. That's 3. Let's go ahead and basically copy that. That's 3. And then just make sure that I actually did change that to 3. Good. And save. My save shortcut little sort of thing has disappeared. There we go. And I broke it. Oh, I know why. Okay, so the problem here is it's just position. All right. All right, there we go. Okay, so that's not working right now. Let's have a look at that. Hey? Say again?
You forgot we just in the event in context.
I forgot to register. No, I think I did. Let's have a look at that. Context.js. See the, you're right. Very good. Very good. Yeah, you're right. Good. Windows X. Very good. Good catch. Ref is equal to. Oops. If this fails, in order to save time, I'll basically pick up my branch. Eh? Yes, of course. Oops. Let's start. Let's see if that works. Woo! Yeah, okay, good. All right, so obviously I need to put the style in place. Can we go ahead and just, just for completeness sake, let's go ahead and do that. So essentially I'll just put in a class name is equal to control. Okay. And hopefully that's it. All right, so you can notice that this thing's global now, right? That thing works for everything, which is it should be, because it's essentially in the global state, whereas the other ones basically work particularly for their particular one, okay? But this is not quite the end of the story, and if you would bear with me for just a few minutes longer, there's something else which is very important, because right now, what we've done is we've basically shown you how you can basically set up a state tree and actually have a provider right at the top in index.js. Let's come back here. You've got your state tree and you've got an index.js provider. Okay, you don't actually have anything with regards to that inside the app.js, which is pretty cool. And then all of a sudden, one of the child components is able to all of a sudden bring that out. Sounds a bit like Redux, like MobX, like all these other things. Okay. However, there is one thing that we haven't done there, which is awfully important. All right, and that is what happens if one of the child components needs to update the state. How do I basically push that up? Okay. Well, actually, it's not very hard. Should we go ahead and quickly do that? Okay. So in order for me to do that, let's go ahead and basically make this scenario also very trivial. All I'm going to do is I'm going to basically say, if I click this thing, I want some count somewhere to basically render the count. Something like that. Okay. And we'll do this in this little, we'll do this in here, right? So we'll basically click this particular one, and when I basically click this one, then essentially one of these other ones are just going to count a counter. Is that cool? All right, let's get started, right? So the thing is that there's a couple of things I'm going to need. The first thing I'm going to probably need is essentially just a counter, okay? And we'll basically initialize that to 0, okay? And then the other thing I'm probably going to need is I'm going to basically need a non-count. And what we'll do is we'll basically just say, let's just not do that way, sorry. What we'll basically do is we'll say this dot set state, and we'll basically say count is going to be this dot state dot count plus 1. Yeah, done. Okay. And now all I need to do in order for this to work is I need to basically change the way that this is going to basically be passed through. So probably a better pattern than basically just passing in, oh, I'm in the FCC, that's wrong. I'm in the wrong thing, guys, I'm sorry. Let's change that quickly. Go back to context and put that there. Oh, not there. Okay. And we'll basically come in here, put that here. Okay, there we go. All right, you get the idea? I shouldn't have been putting it in the file. I was putting it in the file as child components. I should be putting it in the context API. So essentially, what I'm going to do here is, you notice over here that I'm basically just passing in this dot state dot position. It makes it very impossible, because I mean, yeah, I can come in here and I basically can do this. I can say, all right, so essentially I'm going to basically pass an object. Let's just collapse this so we can see it a bit better. And I'm going to say position, colon, and then I'm going to say counter, colon, blah, 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 blah. All right, why bother? Let's basically just let's dot state. Yeah, that's going to basically pass my whole state through. And then, of course, the other thing I actually also want to pass through, right, is my onCount. Well, it's actually this dot onCount, isn't it? Well, onCount is going to be this dot onCount. Okay, make sense? All right, let's see how that works. All right, so that's pretty much all I need to do on there. Let's go to here. All right. And let's go ahead and put in a click command on this thing. So let's just collapse this so we can see the code. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say on click is equal to pause dot on click. Okay, and of course that is a method. All right, so we can basically do, but what we need to really sort of actually do a little bit more in order to actually see it. So we'll come out to one of these other ones. We'll just basically grab this thing here. Let's go to mouse one over here. And what we'll do is we'll basically just extend this to basically also consume that. And we'll basically show that value in here. Is that not too complicated? Is that okay? Yeah? All right, so in order to do that, let's go ahead and basically just break this out. We'll have to wrap this up in a, should be fine actually. All right, cool. And then the last thing that's missing is, of course, the way that we consume it. All right, and then of course over here, what we want is just the count, right? So that's going to just be pause dot count. And if the demo gods are all being kind, which they very seldomly are, by the way. All right, we got that working, and that's not working yet. We've got this undefined in the middle of there. Sorry? Ah, you mean here? On click is on count. Oh, good catch. Nice one. And then position is probably wrong as well, right? So what is it going to be? It's going to be pause.position. Yeah. Sorry? Huh? Just the X file. Ah, right. Pause.position. Yes, you're right. Correct. Guys, thanks for bearing with me. I know it's a lot to take in, and you know it's easy to make lots of little mistakes like this, but hopefully. Yeah. All right. It's about a mouthful, right? Okay, but just to summate, okay, just want to basically go through this one more time. So essentially, there's 3 steps. Let's just refactor this code. I'm used to this from the keyboard. So essentially, there's 3 steps. Okay. First, you basically create a mouse context, and you do that with create context, and you basically pass in some default value. Then essentially, you go ahead and create a class with state, as you always would with any other state, okay? And then essentially you get the mouse context or the context that you have, and you basically point in the provider and you pass in the value that you want to pass down to the children, okay? If you want to pass down a function, you can do that as well, Very easy. You just pass that down as well. Then, essentially, your second step, once you've actually exported that stuff, go to your index, wrap your application inside it, this mouse provider here. Okay? Once you've done that, you use child as a functional component to consume it. Got it? All cool. Great, thanks for your attention on that. That was quite something. Okay. Time for questions? Yeah, just a few questions? Yeah? Oh, wow. All right. Start over here.
Can the wrap many different parts of the component to many different providers?
That's a really good question. So that, I think, depends really much on the context of your application. I generally like the idea of having a single state store. And what I've actually done, if I find that this thing over here gets too big, is I generally find myself basically just very simply refactoring that state out. You can do that by simply just pushing it into another method and putting it outside of this function and putting it into its own module. And then you can have a whole big object that basically handles all that state for you. So I like the idea of having a single state because I've been burnt by having two different states and all of a sudden realizing that the one has to update the other and it becomes really complicated. But having said that, there's nothing that stops you from having multiple contexts and nesting them. So you can have multiple contexts and nest if you wanted to. So it really depends on the style. Okay.
You have say 4-level children, and you want to just pass to that children instead of passing from child 1 to the child 2 to child 3. You can just do a consumer at the last.
Yeah, you can just put a consumer at the last level. Cool. Yes.
Are there any negative tags? So if you have this component now, you have every component have that state change. So will it, when the state changes, what will rendering a state?
No, actually it won't, which is interesting. Okay, but essentially one of the problems, just to come back to your question, one of the big problems with the original context APIs was that you've got an overload method in your React components, which is essentially should component update. And you would generally return a true or a false out of that to say, I don't want my component to re-render because it's too expensive. So I would have to do some sort of check in there to see, right, do I want to re-render my object? And it would go ahead and do that. And that was part of the problem with the original context API, because part of the problem with the original context API was the fact that it would ignore that. In other words, if you had that set to false, your children wouldn't update. Okay, but I could be wrong on this. Okay, but I think it basically just, it updates the DOM tree. Okay, but essentially, pretty much it will, if any of those other components, like you've got two branches over here, and you're only consuming it in this branch over here, just that branch will update. Okay, yeah. Yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I actually haven't checked that. I don't know. I'm not actually sure about that. I don't think it does, but I'll have to double check that, yeah. Okay, the question was, does it actually, I should repeat the question. The question was, does it actually add it to the proto of each object? But I don't think it does. Okay, yes?
Can we use this as a key for every element of the tree?
Can we use this for a key and element on the tree? Yes, you can, but I don't see why you would. You'd need it, because essentially, you remember that you still basically would want to apply sort of the consumer or essentially the container type of model. So, if you've got a really, really complicated structure, you'd probably, you could go down 3 or 4 levels. Then you'd create a container. You basically inject your props into that via your, father, child, consumer, you consuming the context, and then from there you'd have your properties basically distributed down. So it would make more sense to basically architect it like that, so that you don't wind up with too much of, oh God, there's things going on all over the place. You could do that, but I would preferably do it that way. Just architect it a bit more saner. Yes.
Back to the diagram about alignment, I don't think the first rectangle is properly aligned.
This guy is obviously a UAT expert. He's a tester. Yeah. No, good point. Okay, I'll basically put it on the GitHub and you can fix it afterwards. All right, great. Thanks, guys. You're welcome. My pleasure.
All right, guys, going to take a 10-minute break and we'll get right back into it with Ben Teese. He's going to talk a little bit about how he scaled from 2 developers to 20 developers at Swartz. All right, fantastic. Next up, we're going to have Ben Teese works with Solutions, and he's currently working on site at Swartz. Been working there for 5 years, and then they're using React as of late. He's going to talk a bit about scaling from 2 developers to 20 developers with React code. Take it away, Ben. Cool.
Okay, guys, no objections, so let's do this. Okay, so yeah, for the last year and a half, I've had the privilege of working on a React replatforming project. Lots of stories about this project. I'm going to one, and that is just how we grew the team, because it's actually a really big project. And you know, when I first started, I was kind of scared as to how this was going to scale. It's gone remarkably well. So the way that we're going to do this is, I'm going to just start by giving a general overview of the project and its motivations. I won't go into a huge amount of depth, just because there's around other talks that come out of that. But most importantly, I'm going to how our foundations laid the project that enabled us to grow it. And, you know, to the credit of management, it was something that they were very mindful of from the beginning. Then I'm going to talk about kind of the things that in reality confuse developers about what we've done about React and Redux in general, because it was really informative to see other developers come onto the project to see what could come up. And then finally, I'm just going to close out with this kind of funny story about how we almost got killed by not having our site be called by Google. But don't worry, there's going to be code. We're going to be talking a little bit about people and processes, but there's going to be a little bit of code in this presentation, so don't panic. All right, so let's start at the beginning. And in the beginning, there's Tyrone. And Tyrone is the iOS engineering lead at Swartz. And he's responsible for the iOS app, or at least he leads the team building the iOS app. And it's an Objective-C app, pretty old school. And this is Damon. He's the web engineering lead at Swartz. He's actually sitting right there as well. And Damon is responsible for the desktop website and also the mobile website. The mobile website is written with Backbone. I don't even really know what the desktop website is written with. I've heard rumors that it's Tickle. So, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, okay. So these clients, all three of these clients are very complex, probably one of the most complex sort of apps that I've worked on. There's lots of very complex client-side business logic that needs to be implemented. And the problem was that every time a new feature was added or a bug needed to be fixed, it needed to be fixed in each of these three platforms. This was, and you know, in the case of desktop, this was becoming less and less feasible. Desktop was really lagging behind, but it was a real pain. And also, frankly, Tyrone was kind of mad. He was mad as hell. Despite being an iOS developer, he was sick of Objective-C because it was just so verbose. He was sick of Swift because he bought into Swift 2 and then he had to upgrade to Swift 3 and it'd been a giant pain. He was just over it. And so I think Damon saw a chance here to turn Tyrone to the dark side being JavaScript. And Tyrone was remarkably receptive to this. In fact, I think in his own words, it was something along the lines of, I wanted to hate it, but he couldn't find a reason, something like that, okay? And the reason that JavaScript had appeal for us was because of React and specifically React Native. And it gave us an opportunity to have one code base to rule them all, so to speak, or we could put the bulk of our business logic without having to re-implement it across platforms. And so the guys sort of began tentatively doing a little bit of exploratory work to sort of see how this would play out for them. So first step was deciding that they were going to take a look at React and React Native, and that's why I'm here tonight. Now the story kind of really begins. And so what were the next steps that the guys did? I think one thing about Tyrone was he, being a good old Objective-C developer, he's used to using Xcode, he's used to having completion. He didn't want any of that free-for-all JavaScript scripting language madness without types. So it was pretty much a imperative for him that we use something like TypeScript to implement types in our code base. And that was a good decision, not only for them, just for Tyrone's sake, but also just with the size that this project was going to scale up to. Looking back, it was a really, really important decision to make. I mean, the way that I tend to think about static type checkers is that for large plain JavaScript code bases, it's kind of like your large JavaScript code base. It's kind of like if you've got small children, you know, you may be able to understand what your toddler is saying, but no one else has got any idea whatsoever. You know, it's just like a drooling, mumbling thing, you know, okay? And that's what large JavaScript code bases are like, whereas TypeScript lets you bring a bit of sort of discipline to the process. I think the next big decision that the guys made up front was that they wanted to use Redux. I'm not 100% sure why they wanted to. I think it might be the reason that most people decide to use Redux. Does anybody know what that reason is?
Everybody uses it.
Because everybody uses Redux. That's exactly right. So, but in all seriousness, they did look at MobX and things like that. But I think, again, Redux is probably a pretty good call. It's a standard. It might be a lot of boilerplate involved, but it is a pretty good standard. There's a pretty good standard pattern for doing things. And as I'll relate a little later on, it kind of saved my life later in the project. So those were kind of the three big decisions. And we had these two engineering leads. And what they wanted to do next was kind of validate some of these decisions that they'd made, or at least sort of fill something out. And a really good way to do this in a project is to pick a vertical slice and implement it kind of top to bottom in the client side. So that's what they decided to do. And to do that, they introduced a third person, Tim, who's a senior iOS developer. He's actually now an iOS engineering lead. At the time, he was a senior dev. And Tim was tasked, and I believe Damon helped him out with this, to implement something called multi-builder, which is kind of like a complex thing for assembling bets that, you know, have lots of different odds from lots of different areas. So here's kind of a video. Is it playing? Yes. Okay. Here's multi-builder in action. So this is actually a mobile app that's been stretched out slightly, so excuse the ugliness. So this is the general kind of gist of it. You know, we pick out bets and we place them. And the good thing about multi-builder is it's a complex component, but it is quite self-contained. Okay. So it was a really good way for them to test some of these ideas, and that's exactly what Damon and Tim did. Tim set about writing multi-builder with React Native, and this is kind of what he ended up coming up with. Now, it's not doing animations in this video. I don't know why. It actually is supposed to animate bets down into the little green box there. But it was quite impressive what he managed to do. And then a similar thing was done with web over here. And the cool thing about this is these are actually the same code base. It's all React and React Native. And I'd estimate really that about, let's see, the Redux store is the same, the action creators are the same, the reducers are the same, the container components are the same. The only thing that is different is the presentation components at the very top, which is pretty nifty. I'd say we've got about 80% code reuse at least. But that's another talk in itself. Hopefully Damon's going to be able to get a chance to do that talk here someday, because it's really interesting, some of the technical things that came up. But that's kind of the general gist of that vertical slice. And having proven that, the guys were satisfied that they were you know, keen to proceed. So we had these three, and this is kind of where I came onto the project. So I just nagged these guys endlessly until they let me onto the project. And one thing about me is I like to read docs, like extensively. So whereas as engineering leads, they didn't really have the time for that sort of thing. So I had a reasonably good understanding of what the right way to do things with Redux and React and state management and so on. We also got in James, another senior web developer, who had historically worked on mobile web, is very excellent engineering judgment, and all-around good guy, and a great JavaScript coder. And finally, we got on Stuart. Now, Stuart is a very smart bloke. He hadn't so much experience with React, but he was an absolute guru when it came to this betting domain and all of the internals of the betting systems and all of the names of the users and the nomenclatures and business rules and so on. So we were basically labelled the foundation team, and our job was to get this thing to the point where more people could pile onto the project and do it in a manner so that it didn't get completely out of hand. And so we've proven this one vertical slice. Now we needed to get in place some of the horizontal decisions that would affect everybody. So we needed to get them in place up front before other people got onto the project. Probably the most significant of these was Jest. We brought in some testing. It's funny, just taking a step back. So like I said, I knew a bit about Redux. And so, for example, one thing the guys hadn't done is they hadn't used the React Redux bridge. So they weren't using Connect, if you're familiar with it. Basically, they were just kind of passing the store around themselves, around the project, and just dispatching to it directly. I kind of said, well, you know, you can have this notion of using Connect, you can wrap your components and so on, and that's really cool. In untangling that, I realized they had some circular dependencies because they just had this store being passed absolutely everywhere, which made it very difficult to test, but they didn't really realize that because they didn't have any tests up until that point. So we introduced Jess. James had some really good ideas for how to meaningfully test Redux stores and action creators and reducers. We did a little bit of snapshot testing for iOS. We also used Selenium for a bit of web testing too. So that was one thing we got in place. The next thing was a CSS in JS framework. In the end, we landed on type style. It's kind of funny, the story around this. So early on, we used CSS modules. And I, at the time, was I considered that a good baseline for, you know, to use for building your CSS, because it was kind of the standard. You got, you know, really good name spacing of your CSS. And also there were just so many CSS and JS frameworks out there that I didn't honestly know where it was going to land. The guys were extremely keen to use the CSS and JS frameworks. And I was like, no, just wait till the dust settles, you know, before we pick it. And then I was away sick for 3 days and I got back and they shifted the whole thing to a CSS and JS framework. And that CSS in JS framework was type style, which is a TypeScript specific framework that comes with really great typings for CSS. And in retrospect, it was a really good decision that they did that because it picks up heaps of issues with our CSS just by virtue of having a type system of its own. Final thing that we worked on, not so much a technical decision, was this thing called the bet slip. And this is where Stuart really sort of came into his own. James had sort of was kind of our CSS sort of expert, getting the CSS and JS going. Stuart, due to his immense kind of knowledge of the back-end systems behind everything, was tasked with implementing most of what's called the bet slip. And that's sort of the place where all of the bets that a user has chosen to make get piled into one spot, and then you can set stakes on them and change the type of bet. And the bet slip kind of has to be, or at least the basics of a bet slip need to be done up front, because just about everyone else in the app is going to want to talk to it. So it was something that needed to be done first, and that's what Stuart did. So these were a whole bunch of kind of horizontal layers that needed to be put in place before we could move this thing forward. So let's just recap a little bit the story so far. So the guys, to their credit, started very small, because it can be tempting to pile a whole bunch of devs onto a project early on and just chaos reigns. And they made a couple of really key technical decisions that played out quite well, even before I joined the project and certainly afterwards. They did a vertical slice to kind of prove that technically it was going to do what they wanted to do, because it was quite an ambitious thing they're trying to do here. One code base for a native iOS app and a couple of websites. And then finally they brought in a few more of us, and we kind of fleshed out some horizontal areas like CSS, testing, things like that, you know, really critical business logic like the bet slip. And things were looking pretty good at that point. So then the question for us was, well, how are we going to bring other people into this project? How are they going to get up to speed with everything we've done? So one of the first things we did, and this is something that Tim put a lot of work into, was we kind of made a boot camp for the project, like a course, because there's a whole bunch of different technologies involved in this. You know, we had Webpack, TypeScript, Redux, React, React Native, Jest, a whole bunch of things. And there wasn't much information about how to debug them or use them. We had Gulp, we had TS-Lint, we had TypeStyle. So we actually just had a little course that people would work their way through to get familiar with React and Redux, because a lot of them had never used any of these tools before. And that was a really good start. But, you know, to be fair, until you see this sort of thing working in real life, you don't know how effective it's going to be. So what we kind of needed was a couple of people who we could experiment with and see how they went with this course and what tripped them up and what didn't. So this is Dimitri and Daniel. Okay, so Dimitri is a senior web developer and Daniel is sort of a combination iOS and web developer. I'm honestly not even really sure how Daniel got onto the project. He kind of pulled this sort of Jedi mind trick where he just said to us, you will let me onto the project. And we said, we'll let you onto the project. And he was on the project. But he ended up being really useful because these two guys became our crash test developers. They were the ones who sort of were tasked with going through all the stuff that we'd written, and we wanted to see where they trip up because both of them had used Backbone a lot in the mobile web app. Daniel was an iOS developer, so he was also kind of familiar with, you know, MVC patterns and so on. And it was really interesting to see where they got tripped up. So I'm not going to blame all of this on Daniel and Dimitri because some of these lessons were learned from other developers too, but in summary, these are kind of my top 3 things that confuse new React and Redux devs to the project. And in my opinion, like the absolute number 1 is basically state management and understanding how to do state management properly and not to just create foot guns for yourself and other people. Then there's Redux action creators, which kind of confuse people a lot, and frankly, sometimes with good reason. I'll get onto that in a second. And then finally, there's the React lifecycle hooks, which unless you're like me and just obsessively read documentation, can be really confusing to many devs. So now I'm going to show you some code and some examples of these issues in action. We'll start with state management, which actually, in my opinion, is kind of the big unsolved, still unsolved, even with Redux, problems of kind of building single page apps. And I think it's one thing where there's going to be more innovation in future. And it even actually ties a little bit to what Mair was talking about before with options using context to things like Redux. I think state management is not a solved problem. I think that the React team know that. I'm interested to know where things like GraphQL are going to tie into this. But right now we're using Redux, and there's some basic lessons that the devs needed to learn. So here's sort of the fundamental issue with state management in React and Redux is you've got to avoid state duplication or derivation. You can't have the same thing represented twice in your state tree, otherwise bad things happen, and React and Redux can't make as many guarantees about good behavior as they would otherwise. So I like to say that the good thing about React is it forces you to think very long and hard about your state management, and the bad thing about React is it forces you to think very long and hard about your state management. Okay, and other frameworks might delude you into thinking that it's not an issue. I think they're just kind of obfuscating it, whereas React puts it front and center due to its functional nature. So here's an example of a presentation component. All it really does is if it's got a prop called isEmpty set to true, it'll display in some empty screen component. It also gets some records, props, passed into it, and it will render those if the isEmpty flag is false. So isEmpty just means are the records, is there nothing in the records array? Okay, and traditionally we do this using the React Redux bridge by having a map to state to props function you can see here, and it takes records from state and isEmpty from state and then wraps them. So, so can anyone see what the issue is with this already? Sorry? Exactly, yes. So we've actually got duplicated state here because we have the records themselves in an array, and we have another value that just says whether that array is empty or not. But we could tell whether the array is empty or not just by looking at it. You know, we don't need to compute this separately. But what often happens is, I've just included a couple of TypeScript type defs here just to make it clear, is if your state has this shape where we've got records, which is an array of records, and an isEmpty flag, and say we've just got some action. In our reducer, what we're doing here is we're looking at our state and we're going, okay, well, I'm going to set records just to be the records that came in on the action, and I'm going to set isEmpty to be action.records.length 0. And that's a problem doing that because we've got two things in state that are actually intertwined, but there's nothing to stop someone else coming along later on and changing one but not the other, in which case we're in trouble. So the solution to this sort of issue is to deduplicate this information in your Redux state. We only actually need one thing in state, and that's the records array. Our reducer only actually needs to have that record set. At render time in map state to props, we can compute whether it's empty or not. Okay? So we can move this logic out of the reducer into what happens in map state to props. Now, lots of developers, especially if they've come from any sort of object-oriented background, get very uncomfortable when they see stuff like this happening. At best, they start worrying about performance. At worst, they start worrying about code duplication. So convincing people or getting people into the functional mindset that React users proved to be a real kind of challenge, because they would be really tempted to just pop stuff in little places like interim values. So I'd regularly have people go, okay, Ben, that's great. I'll remove this value from this duplicated value from the Redux state, but I'll just put it on component state instead. And they'll be like, no, you can't do that. You can't put it on the component state. Exactly the same thing applies. You can't have derived state, and even in component state. And then sometimes they'd even go, oh, I'm just really worried about performance on this, so I'm just going to make it an instance variable on the component, which is probably even worse, because once you start doing something like that, React isn't even really aware of what this instance variable is. It doesn't know to re-render if that instance variable changes. It's just all badness. Basically, with React, it's like a gateway drug for functional programming. You've got to embrace functions, okay? And frankly, at first, you've got to compute as much as possible, okay? And if you do have performance issues, dropping values into the store or onto component state or just directly onto a component is not the way to deal with it. You know, it's a functional tool. If you're going to do any performance enhancements anywhere, it'll be at the functional level. You do function memoization. You store values against functions, basically. And there are tools that can do that for you already. There's things like reselect. Even Lodash can do a little bit of memoization for you, okay? That was something that really, really tripped people up. And, you know, I ended up calling it performance anxiety, or I'd have these devs, you know, really worried that there were going to be performance issues. And I'm like, well, computers are fast. You know, they're really fast. You don't have to worry about this stuff. And if there is a problem, there's a solution, you know. But, you know, in the absence of any measurable performance issues, you know, let's just let the computer do its thing, which is be fast. Even if we're recomputing a lot of stuff over and over again. Most of the time, 99% of the time, it doesn't matter. So next big pain point for developers was Redux action creators. And look, to be perfectly honest, does anybody here know Elm? Any heard of Elm? Right. So Elm's kind of similar to Redux in many ways, but I prefer Elm's model of side effects, where in Elm you actually return, as well as returning a new state from a reducer, so to speak, you also return any side effects that should take place. Whereas Redux doesn't really have that notion, or at least not out of the box. If you want to do side effecty stuff, you do it in action creators, and that causes a lot of confusion. It also means that you can't have as much business logic as you'd like in Redux reducers. But that's just the way Redux is, okay? So here's sort of one of the big sort of issues we saw early on in the project, and that is multiple dispatches. So here we have a action creator. It's returning a thunk because it's doing something asynchronous, okay? At first, it's just going to dispatch a message saying, I'm fetching some records, and then it's actually going to go ahead and fetch those records, and then when asynchronously that response comes back, it's going to iterate over each of those records and dispatch an action to the store for each record, which is a problem if you've got hundreds or thousands of records, basically. Because every time you dispatch, it's like this very sacred wall that you're jumping over. You know, you're kind of forcing React and Redux to go through this reconciliation process again. At best, it's hard to debug, and it kind of defeats the purpose of using Redux, especially, you know, it's much vaunted time travel debugging. At worst, it's going to cause you performance issues. So one really big thing that we had to drum into developers was to move as much as possible into reducers, and really to aim for just one dispatch per tick of the event loop. So in this case, we've got our initial fetching records dispatch when the user clicks, you know, and this action gets triggered. So that's one tick of the event loop. Our async call goes out. It returns on another tick of the event loop, and then we dispatch that we received all of those records in one hit, and we leave it up to the reducer to do what it will with those. Now, this isn't always achievable, but it's just because of the Redux model, and as I said, in comparison to Elm, but it's something definitely worth aiming for. Otherwise, you can end up with some really tricky to debug code and potential performance issues. Just generally speaking about moving stuff from action creators into reducers, here's another example. We have a button-clicked action creator here. It's using a thunk, but it doesn't actually need to. The only real reason it's using a thunk is because it's looking at state to decide whether it should do something, and then it dispatches an action. So the reducer doesn't actually have to do much other than, you know, set a message. But we've got logic in this action creator that's hard to debug. Like if you use time travel debugging, the logic that's in an action creator isn't really subject to time travel debugging, because by the time you get to time travel debugging, all you have is a series of events that have been dispatched. The best you can do is, or all you're really able to do is dispatch what happens in reducers. So you want to shift as much as possible into reducers. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to stop using a thunk in our action creator because we don't really need to, and we're just going to dispatch an action, and then we'll get the reducer to do all the work of checking state and having logic and so on. But this was a concept that really a lot of devs really struggled with early in the project. Okay, last but not least is React lifecycle hooks, something that caught a lot of people out. Now, the good news is, I don't know if you know, but in React really recently, they've started to overhaul the way that lifecycle hooks work, mainly to support async rendering and so on in future. So whereas we originally had all of these lifecycle hooks at the start, and devs would freely pick and choose from amongst them without really knowing what they were doing, they've actually started to deprecate some of them, which is really, really good. Especially component will receive props and component will mount caused a lot of confusion. And I'll get back to that in a second. One of the big, and this ties in a little bit with state management, probably one of the other big bugbears for new developers to React is derived state from props, okay? Developers always think they have to do it, and most of the time they don't. All they need to do is move the state up a little bit in the component hierarchy, if that's where they're storing it. If they're using Redux, they mightn't have to do it at all. And so this is such an important distinction to make, that whereas in the past developers would have to kind of patch it together themselves by deriving some state from props when the component was first mounted, and then making sure that they correctly updated it later on if the props ever changed. Now there's a dedicated function that they can use for doing this sort of thing. It's not perfect. You don't actually get previous props passed to this, get derived state from props due to some sort of async rendering issues that they're anticipating. So it's still going to be a little bit gnarly. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But it's certainly a big improvement on what we had before. And then finally, we have get snapshot before update. This is a new function that's been added. I've got no idea what it does yet. I don't understand.
It actually does pretty much what you've actually said before. So essentially, before it actually updates the state.
Okay.
The props.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, if you want to see before it actually updates, we'll do that.
All right, sweet. And even if you have people, even if they understand lifecycle hooks, there's still developers still need to be educated about what constitutes a well-behaved component. You know, as soon as your component needs to interact with the outside world and do something in the outside world, it needs to be able to tear down whatever it's done in the past. So here's kind of a pseudo example of something we found in the code base. Someone's kind of passing in an element by the looks of it to a component as a prop. I'm like, well, okay. But can anyone, and they're adding a listener to it, which is okay, but can anyone see what the problem with this is? I mean, the big issue is that this component update could get called over and over again, okay? And we're never, and you know, it could get called with new scroll elements over and over again. But all we're ever doing is adding listeners. We're never removing the listeners, okay? So this is basically like a memory leak. You're looking at a memory leak. A little one, but a memory leak nevertheless. So it's really important that developers just do something like this and make sure that they know that they've got to undo any work that they might have done previously. And frankly, removing an event listener, even if none has been previously defined, this will just no-op, you know. So, but devs need to know to do this. And they also would probably need to remove the event listener when the component unmounts as well. So to kind of teach developers all of this stuff, we, going beyond our original course, we actually created dedicated pages for, you know, how we want you to manage state. You know, here are the things that have tripped us up and so on. And these are the decisions that we've made about how we use Redux. And these are things we want you to do with action creators and so on. But again, you know, my response is often, oh, developers just should read the docs because that's what I like to do. But to be honest, you know, not all developers want to read docs like I do, you know, at home. You know, so, and they want to add value to the business or something like that, or they're domain specialists, you know, that's what they want to focus on. So we needed something else, okay, and that was code reviews. But before I do, there's just one sort of, now I've kind of given the impression that we got everything right up front, but we didn't. And so I'm just going to tell this quick story, and it starts with this guy called Jay. And Jay is actually a business analyst in our team, and we were flying along, we were doing great, we were kicking goals, high-fiving, and in a stand-up one morning, Jay basically said, so what are you guys going to do about SEO? And we were like, I don't know, does it matter? And he was like, and Jay used to be a developer of the desktop site. And Jay was like, well, you know, I don't know much about these single page apps, but I hear Google can't really crawl them, or at least you can't rely on them being crawlable. And we're like, oh yeah, okay. No, I'm sure there's an answer to that, you know. And so we kind of went away and realized that a really good point. And our app was not crawlable at all by Google, and Sportsbet, and often for many single page apps, this isn't a problem because they only really operate in a logged in mode. So Facebook themselves, their apps don't really need to be crawlable because you really have to be logged into Facebook to get much done, you know. But for people like us at Sportsbet and Seek have the same thing, you know, the content that their single page app produces needs to be crawlable by Google. But as soon as that needs to be the case, you can't really, there's mixed information about how much JavaScript Google can handle, but you can't really rely on it. So what we needed to do was we needed to server-side render, which is kind of a scary prospect at that point because we were just about ready to go. This thing was just running down the runway, ready to take off, and we needed to now convert it so that we could server-side render. So a number of things had to change. Firstly, we're using Rack Router v4, which is great because you can co-locate your data loading with your components. But when you server-side render, you can no longer do that. When you server-side render, you've got to load all your data before you render your componentry because you only get one shot to load your componentry. So now what you need to do is co-locate all of your data loading with your routes, not your components. So we had to do that first. And at this point, I was thanking God that we had chosen Redux because Redux actually made it reasonably easy for us to transition to doing this. We could sort of tick through all of our actions, and associate them with data loading, and then wait till the state was in the condition we wanted, and then feed it to the tree once. And that's fantastic. And then also have a render on the server side once, then also serialize that state, send it to the client, have it rehydrate, and so on. But there were some other implications that people don't think about as much. So from Webpack's perspective, when it comes to server-side rendering React, people go, yeah, it's great. You just get your same code and you just run it in Node and it just works. But the thing is that if you previously had a Webpack build, which we did, which was bringing in images and all sorts of other things, Node doesn't know anything about, a module that's an image or a module that's CSS or a module that's anything else. You need to run it through Webpack first, and bundle it all up still, even before you give it to Node on the server side. So we needed to work really hard to have this second build for our server side. Then there's actually other implications. We actually needed to start running Node, whereas beforehand we kind of had this vague hope that we could just drop the app in an S3 bucket and serve it up to the world. This was not happening anymore. We needed to run it in Node. We needed to write a little express server that wrapped this application. We needed to start using Amazon EC2 instances, and even worse, we needed to use Docker. And all of a sudden, we'd gone from an S3 bucket to this, which is a whole different kettle of fish. And also potential performance issues, because at the moment, whilst you render a componentry in React, your little Node instance is taking a little nap whilst it does that. It's completely blocking. Node's famous for not blocking, but rendering componentry it's just pure computation. It's gone for 100 milliseconds. So we're anticipating some potential performance issues and looking into ways to work around those in future. But I guess my final message for you on this front is firstly, think very hard at the start of a project is you're going to have to think about server-side rendering. And only do it if you really have to. Lots of people are very blasé about it, but it really forces you to change your mindset and the way you think about your app. Personally, I just thank God for Jay, because I suspect that if he hadn't, we would have, who knows, we might have gone straight through to production and had an app that wasn't crawlable by Google, in which case Lena, our head of product delivery, probably would have had us all commit seppuku, it's samurai ritual suicide in the breakout area, and she would have just decapitated us when she was happy that we suffered enough. So, yeah, it was kind of a career damaging move if that hadn't been picked up. All right, so I mentioned before reviews and communicating things to the team. Reviews ended up being really important for us because developers can't be relied upon to read the docs, even the ones that we've written. Although it was really good to have them there because we could refer developers to them when we needed to. Instead, we relied upon things like HipChat and extensive reviews. In fact, at its worst, I was probably spending 4 hours a day reviewing code. But the good news was that slowly over time, people were able to review each other's code as they became familiar with things and the right way to do things. So taking our foundation team here and then our 2 crash test developers, what happened is a couple of members of the foundation team went on and kind of became sort of technical guides for other feature teams of their own. James did that, Stu did that, because those guys like building features, which is fair enough. Dimitri also did the same with a team, and Dan did one as well. I'm just still kind of floating around, dealing with random issues relating to SEO and performance and so on. But it's now got to the point where standalone teams can start on their own. And we've got a whole bunch of people. So I think there's 23 faces on there now. So really in, I don't know, maybe 18 months, we have gone from 2 to 20 plus developers. This is actually only the UI, the dedicated UI developers. There are other developers who are doing back-end stuff as well. So I'd say we're actually up at the high 20s now. And it's gone surprisingly well. The business is happy. We're churning through features. It's going great. So let's wrap this up. My advice, most of all, is to start small. Even if the business is pushing you really hard to go big, start small and get a good foundation in place, and then run it, past real people and identify the pain points and where they're going to struggle with the React programming model. And then finally, just review. It's really important. Teams are now cross-reviewing each other's code, and it's going really well. And we have a burgeoning bunch of React experts within the organisation, and we're able to step back a little bit and, worry about other things. And that's pretty much it from me. Thanks. Any questions? Sure.
What if you have a CMS managing your SEO?
A CMS managing our SEO, yes, our SEO team is very keen for us to do that, and we'll do it eventually.
Have you thought about using Storybook?
I know of Storybook, but we haven't used it. But to be honest, there's so much tech involved in what we're using already that we just were reluctant to pile in anymore.
As far as I know, it's like a Visual K to document your components.
Oh, sure. Well, we do have a living style guide, and that's been really handy, but it's something we built ourselves. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep.
I actually have 2 questions.
Yep.
So first of all is you actually have a React and React Native. I'm quite curious about how these 2 teams share the code. You told us that they share a lot of like reducers actions, but I suppose they are in different levels.
No. So first rule of this project, according to Tyrone, is that we do not have separate React and React Native developers. Everybody's working on the same code and, at least in principle, developing features across both platforms. Now, the reality is that we still need some iOS specialists to get in, and, for example, mess with Xcode, because Xcode's just a beast in itself. But it hasn't gone too badly so far. Just for organizational reasons, the iOS stuff has lagged a little bit and is going to pick up again. So it's got a bit of dedicated iOS developer focus. But long term, the goal is for it to be all just devs, basically, working on things.
Second question
Yep.
is, how do you test containers?
How do I test containers in Redux? Container components?
Yeah.
All right, so okay, at a very high level, we're doing Selenium tests, so that's kind of a test. Selenium's got its own issues. Worst case, if you want, you can. Okay, there's a couple of ways you can do this. I mean, you can snapshot test a container component. Okay, you've just got to deep render it, and then also put a Redux provider around it, and then in theory you can check that the markup that gets spat out matches what it was for the state that came in. That might be super meaningful though, because you can't really test clicks or events or anything like that. So if you want to do that without going the Selenium path, you've probably got to use something like what's the Airbnb framework? Enzyme. You've got to use Enzyme. You've got to mount your components inside something like JS DOM inside Node and send events to it and then check that it responds in the right way. We toyed with doing that, but we haven't ended up doing it so far.
So it sounds like for containers, basically it becomes a.
Sorry?
I mean, for
containers, yes. Container components. At the moment, we're kind of relying on a form of integration test. Yes. But that said, this is not including any of our Redux logic. Okay. We test our action creators and our reducers, admittedly not as part of a container component, but all of that logic is tested by unit tests. Okay.
That's a difficult.
It is, yeah. Yep.
Have you considered using Kubernetes to speed up your performance?
Kubernetes to speed up performance? I'm not qualified to answer.
That's a whole different problem.
Sorry, any other questions? Yep.
What was the time involved to get server-side rendering?
Several months of my life. Any other questions?
Developer or multiple developers?
Oh, it was mostly me. It was kind of on my head. Yeah.
Just a question to Russell. I completely get where you're coming from, and I can imagine that it was quite painful, specifically if you're basically trying to get Webpack to basically give you the funding.
Yep.
But I was thinking that I'm not too sure about the business domain or the logic, but couldn't you basically have that as a static build, and that's it? You're never actually going to rebuild it, so it only basically gets built once, and then essentially that gets pushed out to the client.
So what runs on the, so stuff needs to run on the server side, like content needs to come from a server.
Yeah, so I mean, I get what you're saying, that basically push data into it.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can't just basically have a static bundle, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. I will say this, the async rendering stuff that's coming in React is hopefully going to make server-side rendering a lot easier, basically, because you now will have the opportunity to suspend rendering while data is fetched, so that we can then go back to co-locating data loading with the components that use it. However, there's a number of problems that need to be solved for that to happen. It's probably at least a year or 18 months away. Any other questions, yeah?
As a journey going from 2 developers to 20, has your experience been with version control? Has it been smooth? Has it been more challenges when you're scaling to 20 developers?
Look, we have a lot of PRs. And probably the build process, the build boxes, having lots and lots of builds. Running is hard. It's hard to set Jenkins up to do all of that without dying regularly. Otherwise, not too bad. Finding people to do reviews can be a bit hard, but you can kind of, you know, you can institute kind of cultural issues or deal with cultural issues relating to having people take responsibility for finding someone to review their code, for example, rather than just putting it out there and hoping something happens. So we've had a few issues, but nothing too serious. Yeah. And last questions, yeah?
Yeah, apart from the using enzyme and the just to get to the snapshot test, have you guys ever been trying to do some key feature journey test? I mean, it's automating the journey test, like when you spin up your app, you can actually do the automated test for login feature, for other features, stuff like that.
I think our QA is doing a bit of that. So our Selenium tests are interesting because they're testing components still in isolation. They're testing them actually straight out of our living style guide. Okay, but that doesn't constitute a end-to-end journey test. Our testers kind of take care of the end-to-end stuff.
So you don't do that manually or giving some?
Well, I guess they could do it manually, but we try and automate it as much as we can.
Because we found it's fine.
Yeah. Oh man, well, we're lucky. The iOS devs, oh my god, it's like them trying to automate testing in iOS apps, especially with React Native. It's terrible. Sorry, this bloke he had his hand up for. So. Yeah, okay, so all right, Damon, correct me if I'm wrong here. So, and this is a whole other talk and another thing, but there's actually stuff we've embedded React Native components into the iOS app in prod. Is that fair statement? Mobile web. Yep. So we've actually, another requirement of the business was, they're like, we want you to build these components, and as you go, drop them into the existing apps, which is another kind of challenge of its own and a whole separate talk. So elements of it are in production at the moment. But the plan longer term will be to obviously go to full production releases. But I can't really talk about timeframes for that. So I'm not, it's not my, no, I can't, I'm a consultant, I can't talk about it.
Android, do you guys?
No, there's a separate Android app, but we're not looking at RN for Android at the moment. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned enzyme, right?
Yep.
That's only like one spinning up your app on DOM level, but then you also have a lot of server-side dependency.
Yep.
On getting data.
Yep.
So do you mock that, or like how do you handle that?
Not at the unit. Well, not generally at the unit. Well, like we use Synon, for example, to mock stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. We actually, one really good thing that James did kind of in a previous life at Sportsbet was he invented this thing called Imposter, which is kind of like a whole stubbing server of its own. So our Selenium test against the living style guide actually run against this little mock version of the server, which is, but there's lots of different ways you can slice and dice. This is the way we just done it. I should probably wrap up because this has gone for a while, but I'll be hanging around for a bit if anybody else has got any other questions. So thanks very much.
All right, awesome. So now is the time for announcements. If you're hiring, if you're firing, or you just want to say something really nice, yeah, come up, form a line if you've got anything to say. Try and keep it really short. Yeah. 30 seconds max. Yeah, no worries. Go for it.
Hi guys, my name is David. This is my first time coming to a React Melbourne meetup. It's my first time actually seeing React code. Even though I do learn the code, I've started learning JavaScript recently. Anyway, I work with a whole bunch of different companies that work in mainly the fintech and blockchain space, and we're looking for React wizards. If you have a portfolio, come and see me, please. Thank you.
Hey guys, so some of you know me, some of you are new and don't yet, but I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Kogan. We're really into the React community, and thanks to Kogan for hosting and funding all the events so far that we've put here, and it's been going for a few years. We are always on the lookout for people that are really passionate about what they do. It doesn't mean you're a React guru or a JavaScript guru, but we like people that are passionate in a field and then willing to apply that across the entire stack. We work in Python, Django in the server side, and we have React predominantly in the front end with little bits and pieces of backbone that we are trying to exterminate. So yeah, whether you really want to sort of focus in front end and be a React developer, but also work across the full stack, infrastructure through to the client side front end code that executes, we're looking for you. So please apply devjobs.coden.com or chat to me or any of the team after this. And thanks for all coming. And mobile apps.